Hi, my name is Theolyn and welcome back to my channel. And today we're going to talk about dead souls. And you might say, dead souls? What the heck is that? It is a Russian masterpiece by the author Nikolai Gogol. Gogol, the father of Russian realism, is also known as the comedic author of the novel Inspector General. Gogol inspired other Russian writers like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Written in 1842, Dead Souls is satire. Gogol's satire seems to take pity and have tolerance for the Russian people. But it is kind of biting, it is funny. It does kind of poke fun at the corrupt society. And it highlights the vices and the failings of the Russian society. Either depressed or disappointed with his first novel, he had planned this Dead Souls to be a trilogy, and he wrote the second novel, but then he had a literary temper tantrum and burned the second novel. So this is a review of the first novel, Dead Souls. The story begins with a middle-aged traveler that arrives in an inn in Russia, and everything is described as picturesque. Gogol literally describes everything down to every detail. He might say, we see this at every country inn, or we see this in every inn in Russia, but then he's going to sit there and detail the samovar, everything that's in the room, and it's kind of funny. And then he goes on in one passage when he's just describing an inn, talking about how this is so ordinary, but then he tells you what's extraordinary, and allow me to read it to you. He says, there are certain objects which one sees in every inn. And then he literally goes on to detail everything. And then he goes, except in the parlor, there's a painting of a nymph who is portrayed as possessing breasts of a size such as the reader can never in his life have beheld. And all I thought is, oh, Gogol, if you had only lived to be in 2019, you'd see these things all day long. But anyway, the gentleman traveler we're later told is called Paul Ivanovich Chichikov. So that's our main character. His name is Chichikov. He sits down at the table and he engages in tittle-tattle with the waiter. He wants to know things like, who is the former owner of this inn? What's the current owner? Who's the current owner of this inn? How many lawmakers are in town? How many serfs do they possess? And serfs are basically chattel that were at that time thought to be personal property of the owner. And they were also, an owner was taxed for their serfs. And also, the serfs can be mortgaged, but we'll get to that later. Gogol tells us that a man's standing in society that time was ranked as to how many serfs he owned, kind of like how many slaves he owned, if you were to compare it to American culture in the colonial times. When asked what he does, Chichikov tells everybody that he's a traveling landowner, and he literally inspects the town. He peruses the town. Everything is described plainly, but it's overly described. After a comprehensive glance around the city, Chichikov goes back to the inn. The next day, he uses information he's gathered about all the lawmakers, and he decides to pay calls. So he pays calls he seeks out and meets the governor, the vice governor, the prosecutor, the chief of police, and he really tells them nothing, but he flatters them nearly to death. He gussies up for the calls. He even plucks his nose hair. Thanks, Gogol. We need to know he plucked his nose hair. At the party that he's invited to, a party at the governor's house, and at the party he describes the people there as flies on a sugar loaf. And if you'll allow me to read that little bit, the passage is wonderful. And if you hear skittering and scattering, that's my cat with a feather. So everything seems suffused with light, and everywhere flitting and flashing were to be seen black coats. Even as on a hot summer's day, flies revolve around a sugar loaf while the old housekeeper is cutting it into cubes before the open window. And the children of the house crowd around her to watch the movements of her rugged hands as those members ply the smoking pestle. and airy squadrons of flies, borne on the breeze, enter boldly, as though free of the house, and taking advantage of the fact that the glare of the sunlight is troubling the old lady's sight, disperse themselves over broken and unbroken fragments alike. Even though the lethargy induced by the opulence of the summer and the rich shower of dainties to be encountered at every step has induced them to enter less for the purpose of eating than that for that of showing themselves off in public, of parading up and down the sugar loaf, of rubbing both their hindquarters and their fore against one another, of cleaning their bodies under their wings, of extending their forelegs over their heads and grooming themselves, and of flying out of the window again to return with the other predatory squadrons. So that's how he likens the party goers to flies. At least he didn't put the crap in on there too. So the author tells us that fat men never budge and they never take the back seat. And so he decides, Chichikov then decides to go and sit or mingle with the people that are the stouter of the group. While playing whist, which was a popular card game at that time, he would always query the landowner about how many serfs the landowner owned, and he also then would make calls. Again, he made calls on the chief of police, the president of the council. He spent an evening with the vice governor, the prosecutor, and then he would return to the inn to sleep. On many topics, Chichikov is well spoken. His manner is gentlemanly. He gives way, but he happens to just be able to talk about all these different topics and be able to hold forth on many different conversations. And people just kind of get the pants charmed off of them. He's on a charm offensive and he is winning. Like whenever he would beat somebody at a hand of whist or a hand of cards, he would be like, "Oh, you allowed me the opportunity to play my ace of spades." You know, he didn't ever rub it in. And just people liked him. He was a smooth criminal. Chichikov has two servants. One is a valet named Petrushka. And this is the one thing where you're going, Gogol, you're killing me. Because what he does is he describes this Petrushka as so darn interesting in the passage. He talks about his big nose and his big lips and how he reads like so much and he reads just everything. Doesn't matter what it is. And that when he lays on a bed, he lays in bed and reads so much that it's like mushed down flat. And then he talks about Petrushka having his own really peculiar smell, and then everywhere you go you can smell him coming, or you know where he's been and all this stuff. And he makes Petrushka so darn interesting that you want to know a little bit more about Petrushka. But then Gogol says he's failing to develop Petrushka more because he notes that he is not a main character and that Russians only care about people on a higher rung on society, as societal ladder than themselves. And I'm like, naughty Gogol, what are you doing? Chichikov goes to a landowner's house called Manilov. All right, I know these names are probably odd to our ears, but I mean, if you want to call him Barry Manilow, I don't care. But he goes to a landowner's place. His name is Manilov, and he makes a comment, the devil alone knows who he is. And I don't know why all of a sudden there's some kind of a note about this Manilov, but anyway, he's approaching the Manilov house, and again, it's picturesque. He's describing every single little detail. He's talking about how there's rooms with no furniture, and there's rooms with furniture nobody sits in, and they've got all these huts outside, and that the wife of Manilov is kind of not making her staff behave, like they're kind of wild. and he's just kind of taken aback by that, how Manilov didn't keep a real tight rein on his estate and hadn't really tended things very tightly. But he's still very gallant. Chichikov is gallant with Manilov. And like, just to give you an example, when they go into like the study, they're both like, "Oh no, you first. Oh no, you first. Oh no, you first." And then they both like walk through the doorway at the same time and like bump into each other. It's just like stupid gallantry, but that's how he's introducing this. But as he does, Chichikov and Manilov, they sit around, they flatter each other. After dinner, they go into the study, and like I said, the one's acting, "Oh, you're acting, trying to out-gallant each other." And then Chichikov gets to the point, he starts querying Manilov about how the census and how many serfs he owns and how many serfs have died since the last census. And at that time, I believe they took the census every 25 years. Here in the U.S., back then, they used to do it every 10 years. And sometimes you would find every 20 years. But, so every 25 years, you would have slaves or serfs, and they're considered your personal property. And if one dies, since you're taxed on them, you had to report that. That's where you're getting this backstory. So what happens is he's querying Manilov about how many serfs have died on his property since the last census. And the wife asks, because she's at the table too, well, why are you asking this question? What's the purpose of this question? And Chichikov says, I just desire to purchase a few peasants. And the husband asks, do you want land for souls or for transport? Chichikov says, no, I want the dead ones. And they sit there just for a while, all shocked and silent, like, what? What did you just say? You want the dead serfs? Like, you want the dead souls? What are you saying? But Chichikov was proposing that he wanted the names of the dead servants who had been reported as alive as of the previous census. All right. Well, so meanwhile, Manilov and his wife, too, they're just sitting there in shock, and they think he must be just totally joking. But he says, legally living peasants. And he alludes to he's not doing anything illegal, and he asks for a price for a list of names. But Manilov is like, okay, I'll give you a list of names, and no price, I'll give it to you for free. And Chichikov wants to jump for joy at how easy it is to get this information out of Manilov about the serfs he's had that he owned that had died in the last 25 years that have yet to been reported as dead on the census. So he is just over the moon. He's like shaking with excitement that it was that easy to get the information out of him. And so he proceeds along his way. So Manilov and his wife, neither of which even suspected any kind of con, when asked, they directed him to the next landowner's residence. And so he goes. So in celebration, they've been drinking a little bit. And Chichikov's driver is a little drunk. And they have a carriage, which is in a really strange Russian word they use throughout the book. I'm just going to call it a carriage. But so they're in the carriage, and the carriage capsizes and rolls over in the mud. So they end up having to walk to the next neighbor's farm, which really wasn't the person they intended. And they end up, so they follow the sound of some barking dogs because they're in the dark. They don't know where they are. The carriage is in the mud, and they're walking, and they come upon an older lady that lets them into her house. So Chichikov is always taking the measure of people. He goes into the older lady's house, and he noticed that she's careful with her money. And he just tells her, hey, I'm looking for a bed. I'm looking for rest. And she says, okay, you can spend the night here. But in the meanwhile, while they're bedding down, he's querying her about all the local landowners and all the local officials and getting all the information about the town from her. So the next day, looking outside the house, he sees that she's got some peasant huts out there. So he's like, oh, okay, let me query her about how many serfs she has. And he decides to cultivate her. So Gogol also takes the opportunity to tell us here that the Russians speak to each other according to their wealth and their station in life. So I guess he then starts buttering her up a little bit more because he sees that she's got 80 souls. She tells him her name is Natasya Petrovna Korobochka. So we'll call her Korobochka. And she has less than 80 souls. And he tells her, well, I'm just a traveler on private business. He starts his number about how many serfs she has, how many have died since the last census. And she even tells him, quite a few have died. Even last week, my blacksmith got drunk and he burned himself alive. So she was like, he's like, pray, Madam Korobochka, hand over those dead peasants to me. And she goes, what should I do? Dig them out of the grave? And he proceeds to tell her that the transfer is merely like a transfer on paper. And then she, of course, asks him, well, what good are dead souls going to be to you? Manilov, back the last house, didn't give him any pushback. He's like, yeah, sure, I'll give you the names. They're dead. Who cares? Well, she even starts asking questions. And he replies that giving him the names of the dead souls kind of takes them off her roster or her role. And so it will relieve her of her tax and her tax trouble. And he offers her 15 rubles per soul. But she's troubled by the fact that they are dead. Okay, so she's like, well, she begins to see that this is kind of odd and that maybe he's taking advantage of her, but she's really not sure. So she starts giving him pushback. She starts kind of asking him questions. She says, I've only sold living souls. I've only sold living serfs. So I don't really quite understand this. They're dead. She doesn't really feel that great about it. But he replies to her, what if the dead souls are worth more? And she replies, those dead souls are worth nothing to you. So he's sweating it out. This is the first woman that's given him pushback. And she had sold honey, I guess, at some point. And he's like, this is no different than you selling your honey. And I don't know what the difficulty is. And you're going to be making more off selling me the dead soul list than you will be making honey. And you're doing nothing. And she kind of just still feels confused. And she balks at this strange bargain, giving him a little bit of pushback. And he tells her, he gets all mad. He's like, go to the devil, and calls her a dog in the manger. And for some reason, then she starts feeling like maybe he's a government official. I don't know why, but all of a sudden she kind of gets freaked out and she backtracks and goes, okay, I'll sell you the dead souls. So then Chichikov is off to the next town, off to the next con. You know, he just keeps it moving. He recognizes a stranger that comes into the inn as a man he'd met at a public prosecutor's house, okay? So you got to keep this guy's name is Nozdryov. Okay. So he sees this Nozdryov who's with his brother-in-law. And they're at this inn and they've been playing cards and they've been drinking. And this is how they describe Nozdryov. He's a man of incident. He causes fracases. He parties. He's involved in incidents all the time. He lies without reason and he's pretty adventurous. So he's kind of a blackguard, or just kind of a character. And Nozdryov says, hey, come to my house. And they've been drinking, and he gets the brother-in-law to come too. So he gets Chichikov and the brother-in-law of Nozdryov go to Nozdryov's house. And Nozdryov, I sound Russian. Nozdryov decides to show them around his house and his home and his farm and stuff, and he's just showing them that this object and that object and this animal and that animal, and he's bragging it up. Well, I paid this much for this and this much for this, and the brother-in-law is kind of drunk, and he's like, no, you didn't, and they're kind of starting that Russian banter that they love to do. So the brother-in-law, he gets drunk and he goes home. But when the Russians want to tie one on, they're in for the night to tie him on, and Chichikov he's happy that he's finally got Nozdryov alone, and he wants to start his con. So he asks him if a large number of serfs did not get on the revised census from his place. And Nozdryov immediately knows something's up. He's like, what's in the wind? And so Chichikov tells him he only wants to acquire a better standing in society by looking like he has serfs. And Nozdryov is like, you're lying! Like he knows he's kind of telling a tall one. And Chichikov, accused of lying, takes umbrage, and he goes, to everything there are limits. Like, don't push me any further. So Chichikov and Nozdryov, they're talking, and Nozdryov is not gonna give it up. He wants to talk about this serf issue, and he wants to strike a bargain. So he's like, hey, well, I'll sell you the dead souls and this colt. I'll sell you the dead souls and this. And he keeps offering these things, and Chichikov's like, I don't want that. I just want the dead souls. And so they're just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so finally they agree to play chess. Like the winner will get the dead souls or whatever. But they start bickering and arguing because Chichikov and Nozdryov, they think the other one is cheating. An actual fight occurs between Chichikov and Nozdryov, and Nozdryov is drunk, and just so happens in the nick of darn time, the superintendent of police shows up because Nozdryov had threatened somebody with a walking stick, and so he was coming to deal with Nozdryov over that issue, and so Chichikov takes it upon himself to just make himself scared. He leaves the residence. He's so happy to get away from this crazy Nozdryov. In his fever to get away from Nozdryov's residence, he's in his carriage, and the carriage runs into another carriage on the road. I guess it was a little bit dark. But in the other carriage, there's an older lady and this maiden, and their carriages literally kind of get intertwined a little bit, and the horses get all, the reins and everything get all kind of intertwined, and the horses kind of enjoy the company of the other horses, so they sit there all in a big tangle, and they won't listen to the people trying to pull them apart, and then like the whole town comes and is trying to like pull all these two carriages apart, and it's a whole to-do. But Chichikov enjoys looking at the maiden in the other carriage, and then they also talk a little bit about the horses, and for some reason Gogol sometimes gives you an idea of what the horses think, and that's kind of entertaining too. So yeah, he gets in the horses' minds. I think that today Chichikov buying his dead souls would be kind of like someone buying someone that's passed on to use the voter roll. I mean, that's the kind of con man Chichikov was. And I mean, also you got to think that running a con like this that involves in any way, shape, or form, even the name of a dead person, has got to be some darn bad karma, right? Yeah. So then our hero con man Chichikov goes off to the residence of Sobokovich, and so he is described, Sobokovich is described as very bear-like. Everything about him is bear-like. His furniture is bear-like. He treads on people's toes, and he's kind of a hardy figure. Sobokovich's wife is named Theodolia. Not that common to have another Theolyn or a Theo in a novel, but there you go. When Chichikov mentions the town's officials, because that he's a name dropper, so he'll be like, oh, you know, I know this person, I know that person, because it gets the landowners to kind of open up. And he even thinks that Sobokovich likes this person or that person or that person, and Sobokovich just drags that official to filth in the conversation. But Sobokovich mentions a man named Pushkin who owns 800 souls and is a miser. So, ding, 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 you know that Chichikov is thinking, oh, I've got another mark. Let me go for it. I hear he's a miser, but ding, ding, ding. But anyway, he proceeds to try to squeeze Sobokovich, and Sobokovich says, you're after dead souls? They're none to be found. He said that he didn't have any objection to selling them, but he wanted 100 rubles per head. And so they proceed to engage in some hardcore haggling, because really Chichikov is, you know, you'll see a range of what he's paying per head, and especially if there's a lot of souls, he'll be paying less. But I mean, he's sometimes paying like 2.5 rubles, sometimes 18 rubles. And so right out of the gate, Sobokovich wants 100 rubles per head, and they just sets off a whole bunch of haggling. And in order to maybe kind of boost the price, Sobochikov literally talks about the life and the death of each man in great detail. And this is the kind of the part of the story where Gogol kind of might tire a reader out a little bit, because you know, you're kind of wanting to know, okay, so he's dealing with this guy, then he's going to go to this Pushkin guy, probably try to squeeze him. Do we really need to know about the great detail about every serf that died and how they died, and whether they were a good eater or not a good eater, you know, that kind of stuff. So Gogol can kind of wear you out a little bit in those passages, so I do feel for the reader that gets tired of hearing that. So at one point, Chichikov says to Sobokovich, well, it's just a dead body anyway. And Sobokovich says, well, it must mean something to you, otherwise you wouldn't be trying to buy them from me. So, you know, he has to answer these little sticky wicket questions about why the heck he cares about buying these dead souls without revealing what his major plan is, right? And he kind of implies, you know, that Chichikov kind of must be doing something shady, but he doesn't come out and say it. So he and Chichikov and Sobokovich agree on, I believe it's 3 rubles per head. Another time it's mentioned 2.5. It is noted that he never wants women's souls for whatever reason, but maybe that'll become clear later. So then Chichikov heads off to Pushkin's, as you probably imagined he would. And Pushkin, as he's been told, is a miser. His house is extremely messy, and Gogol's going to let you know how messy it is by detailing all the mess. And Pushkin even looks like a beggar for all intents and purposes. So Pushkin has runaway serfs. In other words, he has on his list serfs that have run away since the last census. He doesn't know if they're alive or dead, but he has those, and they're essentially worth more. So that is what Chichikov endeavors to buy from Pushkin. So now Chichikov has got about 400 souls. He goes to the inn after concluding all this different business, and for some odd reason he's looking at these lists of names, and the lists are done by hand, compiled by the different landowners, and he's admiring the handwriting of this one, or the border that the wife had put around this one on these lists. And he is thinking all of a sudden now, kind of almost nostalgic, about the life of these people on the list and what they must have done. And some of the landowners had put little notes about the person, and so he's looking at it, and I think it's because he finally got kind of what he wanted. So now he feels, in the flush of excitement, he doesn't feel sorry about it. He's just kind of reminiscing. He's dreaming. So he ends up always having to go to the municipal office to transfer the souls. I mean, it's not good enough just to have a list of names. You have to have the transfer, that the owner transfers these to you, and sometimes you get a receipt for the money and things like that, and then you have to kind of put it into the public record. So after he does things like this, he tends to kind of get drunk, or the landowner gets drunk, and they all kind of have a party. And at this point, after Chichikov's been rather successful in buying all these souls, and everybody in town, in this last town, starts to regard him as a millionaire. He is just, how can he, oh my gosh, he's got so many souls, he's got so many people. So everybody in town, now that his station in life has seemingly risen, start to kowtow to him, and they start wanting to set up their daughters with him because he's unmarried. And at a party, he sees that maiden from the carriage crash, and he's just like smitten, and he feels like, oh, he likes her. So Chichikov is at a party. He hasn't left this town, and everybody's thinking high of him. And here comes old Nozdryov. This is the dude that kind of got in a fight with him, and the police came, and Chichikov ran off. Well, so Nozdryov decides to out Chichikov. Or maybe he just did it just because he's a runny mouth, but he's like, hey, how you been doing? How's that trade in the departed souls going? He's just kind of outing him to the whole party. And everybody, meanwhile, has thought so highly of Chichikov and his charm offensive and his smooth criminal behavior, and they just think, well, this landed gentleman millionaire, Nostrov's off his, he's off his rocker. But people start becoming curious about the comments that were made. It did stick in people's mind, like, what was he talking about? Departed souls? What the heck? Because not all the people that were involved in the sale of their souls are going to go blab it around. They're just going to keep it quiet. So all of a sudden, you just got this guy that's come to town, and he's got all these alleged slaves, or serfs. So they're thinking highly of him, and here comes Nozdryov busting into a party, and he's kind of just messing it all up for old Chichikov. But people they become curious about these comments, but at the back of their mind, they're like, well, that Nozdryov guy, he's just a liar. But it sticks in their mind what was said, and they're starting to wonder about it, so they start talking. And this is where Madame Korobochka comes back into the scene. She comes to see about the outcome of the dead souls. She wants to see, she just is kind of unnerved, and she's not really sure about why she sold them, what he had planned. And so she starts interrogating the servants about it. Yeah, and so I know something exciting is going to happen, but that's in part 2. And I haven't gotten to part 2 yet. This is where I left off reading. So you're going to get to enjoy this just like I get to enjoy it, fresh, without preparation. So anyway, if you like this review, please subscribe. Please push the like button. And if you subscribe, you'll be notified of any other classic book reviews I do.